This is hell.
Everybody hates the IRS, that is, until you realize that if it goes away, the U.S. economy will look a lot like that of Greece. And the more poorly the agency is funded, the more likely it is that their auditors will stop going after the rich and big business and start going after the poor. Here to tell us why the IRS may not be as bad as everyone has said it is, and punishing the IRS helps no one, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Jesse Eisinger has returned to This Is Hell. He is a contributor to the sweeping ProPublica investigation, Gutting the IRS. Welcome back to This Is Hell, Jesse.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for having me back.
Jesse co-authored with Paul Kiel 3 of the stories in the series, including Who's More Likely to Be Audited, a person making $20,000 or $400,000 a year, How the IRS Was Gutted, which was co-published with The Atlantic, and After Budget Cuts, the IRS's Work Against Tax Cheats is Facing Collapse, which was co-published with the New York Times. You can find the entire series, Gutting the IRS, at ProPublica.org, and you can follow Jesse on Twitter at EisingerJ. So today we're going to be talking about your writing at ProPublica on the IRS, but the last time we had you on, I knew you had come up in conversation on our show prior to your appearance, and I couldn't remember when it was. So I looked it up, and it turns out you were mentioned in a conversation with Michael Massing, who was on our show, has been on several times. Michael was on to discuss his article that appeared in the New York Review of Books, How to Cover the 1%. In that column, Michael quotes an email he received from you on the news media that reads how they, quote, don't adequately cover how corporations keep their wages down, treat their employees in general, fight unions, lobby for their corporate needs, arrive at decisions to pay their top executives, or dominate their markets. We don't hear about the GM or VW scandals until after they break. Once they do, we get good coverage, but that's archaeology, not detective work. Where is the coverage of Boeing, 3M, DuPont, FedEx, or CVS, energy, insurance, trucking, construction? So how does any lack of coverage of the IRS outside of your investigation fit into your criticism that the news media doesn't cover the stories about big corporations and industry's treatment of workers? Do you see that same kind of criticism? Can you apply that same kind of criticism in the lack of coverage of what's happening with the IRS?
I think you can see it in two ways. One is that the Washington press corps is dominated by people who cover politics and people who cover a lot of frivolous aspects of politics. It's not exclusively frivolous. There's a lot of quality reporting, but it's quality reporting that tends to focus on policy. And then, now we have a lot of focus on the White House, and we've had pretty good coverage, I think, since Trump was elected of the Trump administration, the conflicts of interest, the investigations. That has been pretty good. But what we don't have a lot of is coverage of the agencies. And if you look at the Trump administration broadly, you see a very different picture than the White House. The White House Trump looks incompetent. He looks weak. It's chaos every day. People are coming and going and dishing on him, and all of that is important to understand. But beneath the surface, you have an extremely effective administration. It is not incompetent at all. What you're seeing with the administration is an effective dismantling of the regulatory state. You remember Steve Bannon talked about dismantling the administrative state as a goal. Well, they're doing it. There's some writing about it. ProPublica is trying to focus on it, and others do too periodically, but there's not a sustained effort. And the IRS is part of our effort to focus on the bureaucracy that keeps our country functioning.
And I want to get to your writing, but I just want to follow up on something you said. What does the voter get wrong? What do we get wrong when we view the Trump administration as incompetent? Is that dangerous? Do we do that at our own risk, labeling the Trump administration incompetent?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what they're doing with regulatory agencies is highly competent and highly efficient, and what they're doing is rolling back regulations. So if you look at what they've done with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for instance, is a new regulator that started up in the wake of the financial crisis. It was the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. It was created under the Dodd-Frank sweeping overhaul of our financial regulatory apparatus. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, just to use one example, you can look at the Environmental Protection Agency or the IRS or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, a wide variety of regulators, the SEC, the Department of Justice, in fact. But just take a look at as an example, the CFPB. This was created because of the revelation after the financial crisis that no financial regulator, and we have a ton of them, no financial regulator actually had as its primary mandate looking at consumers and how they were screwed, looking at them and saying, wow, mortgages were an exploitative product that were being sold to people and they didn't know what they were getting and they got trapped in predatory loans. But there are also payday loans and student loans, and military families are extremely vulnerable to predatory lenders. And there was no regulator looking out for them. So what did we do? We created this new regulatory body to just protect consumers. And it was quite effective in the early years. And banks hated it, and financial companies hated it, and the payday lenders in particular hated it. And so what happened when the Trump administration came in? Well, Trump appointed Mick Mulvaney, his director of the Office of Management and Budget, as his side job, not his main job. He had a day job, but as his side job, come in and run the CFPB. And Mulvaney ran it for the first year or so after he got appointed, just as the acting director. And he succeeded with a handful of appointees, 3 or 4 appointees, to go about dismantling it. And if you see Scott Pruitt at the EPA or Ryan Zinke at Interior, and there are a wide variety of regulators, that people haven't really heard of or focused on, like the National Labor Relations Board or the OSHA, the Worker Protection Office. These are being gutted because there's a regulatory strike, so they're not punishing bad actors. You see that at the SEC and the DOJ. And there's also a rollback of regulations that are highly industry friendly. So they've appointed regulators who are actually lobbyists. So the new appointee at the EPA after Pruitt left, he was obviously highly controversial, he's a lobbyist. And he has put in place industry-friendly regulations and rolled them back. So that's what's happening at the Trump administration that it's hard to focus on. It's arcane. It's not as sexy as Mueller's investigation, but that's really where the efficiency is happening. Really, that's competent, and it's directed, and it has specific, clear goals to roll back regulations and aid corporations, and they're doing that.
When it comes to the IRS, has the Trump administration again appointed somebody who is actually opposed to the functioning of that agency, as has happened at the EPA? Is the same thing again happening at the IRS?
It's a slightly different story of the IRS, actually, because the gutting of the IRS is really a pre-Trump story. It's a Republican effort. A Republican project. It was a Republican project, though, that really started in earnest in 2011 when the Tea Party Congress came into power. The IRS has been relatively recently a focus of Republican ire. So if you go back to, it's really a kind of Gingrich contract with America 1990s kind of focus. The idea was we could abolish the IRS. They ran on this slogan. Before the 1990s, you kind of had a bipartisan agreement that we needed a functioning tax system. I mean, and you alluded to it, but I'll just to ground us in the basic premise here. Everybody sort of hates the IRS. They don't like to pay taxes. I understand that. It's not fun to have to pay your taxes. But we have worried in the last few years about having a functioning democracy and whether our Constitution is strong enough to withstand a kind of threat of Trump and his authoritarian tendencies. But before you have a functioning democracy, you have to have a functioning state. And the functioning state is predicated on a tax collection system that works. And tax collection has to work, and it has to be viewed as equitable, that everybody pays into the system. And we are on the verge of having a broken tax collector. We are on the verge of, the IRS is on life support. And the result of that is that we're not collecting taxes adequately. And what that really means is that we are not collecting taxes from corporations and from the wealthy, and that the tax burden is falling disproportionately on the middle class, and we'll get to in a second because you alluded to it, the poor, especially the working poor. But that's the threat, that starts to not just threaten our democracy, but just the mere functioning, the basic functioning of our society. And it's not really a Trump story. It's a story that's happened with Democrats looking the other way and not really resisting and not fighting for the IRS because it's unpopular politically, and the Republicans with a concerted effort to defund the bureaucracy.
You mentioned how the Republican Party, when they came into power in 1994, Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House. That's when the IRS had suddenly become a very popular cause on Capitol Hill. You write the new majority's main priority was tax cuts, and vilifying the IRS helped its case. Some conservatives favored a fair tax, a consumption tax based on purchases. Proponents said that this simplified approach to taxation would allow them to abolish the IRS. And you mentioned how in 97 and 98, the Republican-controlled Senate held a series of dramatic hearings on alleged abuses by the IRS. Agency employees testified behind black curtains with their voices disguised like mafia snitches to protect their identity. The testimony depicted an organization run amok with claims of biased examiners and lurid tales of agents in flak jackets storming establishments. How abusive had the IRS become? How lurid were these stories, and how well did they represent the actions of the IRS at the time?
Yeah, they were incredibly lurid. The one that we wrote about, and that was the most kind of high profile, was a restaurant owner said, the IRS stormed into the house of my manager of my restaurant, and there was a slumber party, a teenage girls' slumber party, and they made the boys lie face down with their guns raised, and they had the teenage girls get dressed in front of them, in front of the watchful eyes of the IRS agent. I mean, it was really kind of lascivious. And so these were dramatic hearings, and the IRS was subject to an enormous amount of political attack and political pressure. And then there was a reform bill, and the reform bill passed, and it had huge number of overhaul aspects to it. It really hindered their collections. It hindered how they should go about audits. They gave taxpayers a bunch of new rights, some of which were good, some of which were needed. This passed unanimously in the Senate. Nobody voted against it. Clinton signed it willingly. And then, the sleepy agency that goes back and sort of tracks things, called the GAO, the General Administrative Organization. You know what? I'm GAO. I'm mangling the name here.
Government Accounting Office.
Thank you. Accountability Office. Yeah. And the GAO did a report to say, like, well, so how much of this testimony was true? And they couldn't corroborate any of it. None of it. It turned out that the testimony was, at the very least, wildly hyperbolic. And so this giant gutting of the IRS in the 90s, and overhaul, was predicated on myths.
And then you write, in 2013, the IRS bulwarks collapsed, first as part of a budget deal with the Obama administration. Republicans got what they had previously sought, a $600 million cut to their budget, which came on top of cuts in the previous 2 years. Then things got even worse. In May, an IRS Inspector General reported that the agency had targeted right-leaning nonprofits for scrutiny, igniting what came to be known as the Lois Lerner scandal, named for the manager who had overseen the effort. Shortly thereafter, another report criticized the IRS for loose spending on its conferences. Republicans seized on both scandals, calling hearings and launching investigations. To you, did the Lois Lerner scandal prove that, in fact, the right, Republicans are correct, the IRS can be this abusive agency it was inaccurately characterized to be in the mid-1990s?
No, not at all. And this is So just to go back to emphasize the point that you just made, but I want to make sure listeners understand that the IRS came into the sights of the Republican Congress in 2011, 2 years before the Lois Lerner scandal. They started cutting the budget then. And the target then was the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare. What people don't understand about the ACA is that it's effectively a giant tax bill. It gave an enormous amount of administrative authority to the IRS. And the Republicans understood this perfectly. And they understood that they didn't defeat the ACA legislatively, so they tried to defeat it through the purse, the power of the purse. And they tried to cut the IRS budget then as a backdoor way of gutting the ACA, hurting the ACA. And to some extent, it was successful, although the IRS really kind of statutorily had to fund the ACA, and so they took away things like auditing, money from auditing. So then you skip forward to the 2013, and the Republicans focused on this supposed abuse in the nonprofit area. And you have to understand the IRS is this sweeping giant bureaucracy. It's got a budget which is down 20% from 2010, but it's still about $12 billion, and it's got tens of thousands of employees. And then it's got this little operation that oversees nonprofits. And the reason it oversees nonprofits is nonprofits are tax exempt. And so you have to be a legitimate nonprofit in order to win tax exempt status. And so what they accused the IRS of doing was overly scrutinizing in a punitive way, in a politically motivated way, overly scrutinizing Tea Party groups that had formed in 2010 to take over the Congress. And they were looking at these Tea Party groups unfairly. That was the accusation. And it's true, there was a little bit of incompetence. It's not like the 10,000 employees are all, tens of thousands of employees are all competent and perfect. And, there's a lot of managerial ineptitude. And they were sort of inept in the way they went about looking at Tea Party groups. But what happened was the GAO looked at it subsequently, and they found that they had not picked out Tea Party groups exclusively. They had not just looked at Republican groups. They had looked at progressive groups too. There were more Tea Party groups than progressive groups that had formed because there was a big backlash to Obamacare, a big backlash to the stimulus, a big backlash to Obama in general. But they had not targeted anybody politically. Again, it was a myth. It was an exaggeration. It was done purposely, exaggerated to attack the IRS and attack the Obama administration.
And Obama appointed John Koskinen, and you mentioned a 2014 House Appropriations Committee where the new IRS chief Koskinen testified. The chairman of the Appropriations Committee was Republican Kentucky Congressman Hal Rogers. You report how after some pleasantries, Rogers, quote, launched into a litany of criticism. The IRS was trying to implement the Affordable Care Act against Congress's wishes. It was spending too much money. It was wasting too many resources, resisting reforms, and letting the poor commit too much fraud. Is there any evidence the poor commits more fraud? Or is that just another part of the other myths that you were mentioning that justifies the IRS being targeted by the Republican Party?
Yeah, so actually there's evidence of the opposite, which is that the most tax evasion and tax avoidance, which are two different things. Evasion is kind of criminal, and avoidance is legal but overly aggressive, and you can be subject to fines. The most tax evasion and tax avoidance happens by the wealthy and by corporations. Repeated academic studies have found that. And it stands to reason because poor people and middle-class people have W-2s. The government knows all about our income. We send it we pay in all the time. It's very hard, throughout the year. I mean, so it's very hard for us to cheat on our taxes. The government has most of our tax money. In fact, most of us get a refund. It's 99% of us comply with our taxes, wage earners, and then the real tax evasion and tax avoidance happens with the wealthy and the super wealthy, the 1%, and corporations. So the poor do not commit an enormous amount of fraud. There is fraud in the poor, and we could discuss this now, or I don't know where you're going to go, but there is a huge crackdown at the IRS of people who receive the earned income tax credit. But the fraud there mostly is unscrupulous tax preparers preparing false returns for people in order to get a bigger return so that they can get a bigger slice of it. So in fact, the poor are kind of doubly screwed because they get audited more, and then they also are exploited by unscrupulous tax preparers.
Yeah, let's get to the earned income tax credit. Who receives the earned income tax credit? Because the last time I knew someone collecting that, it wasn't a lot, but it was a lot for her and her family, and it was for being the caregiver of her daughter's children, her mother being her caregiver of her daughter's children, while her daughter was at work. So other than being people who don't make $20,000 a year, which apparently looks like that's mostly the people who get the earned income tax credit, so who are the people who deserve the earned income tax credit?
Well, yes, exactly. So Paul Kiel and I have been reporting on this, and Paul has really taken the lead on it. The Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the biggest anti-poverty programs in America. And the people who get it are people who work. They are the working poor. They work, but they're not making a huge amount of money. And in fact, on average, typically they make about $20,000 a year. And if you make that and you qualify for it, and there are a complicated set of reasons why you can qualify for it, then you get a check from the government, and the check can run something like $1,500 or $2,000, sometimes $3,000. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's significant for if you're a member of the working poor, if this is 10 or 15% of your annual income. So it's a very effective program. It is a program that keeps a lot of children out of poverty because their parents are able to fund them. And you can see a lot of economic activity in the springtime when people get the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's one of our best, most successful anti-poverty programs.
So why target the people who are getting the Earned Income Tax Credit, and how politically unpopular does going after the poor make the IRS, leading to a weakened IRS, which benefits the rich and will double down on picking off the low-hanging fruit of supposed tax cheats among the poor? Well,
so I don't think actually it makes it politically unpopular to go after them. It's a different dynamic, which is that Republicans don't like the idea that this money is going out the door from the government. And Republicans have, especially, they haven't been, they've been anti-welfare. They've been skeptical of it. In fact, the EITC is a Republican. It's a right-wing. It's a conservative idea. It was a Milton Friedman idea, which is encourage work. Because classically the criticism of welfare has been that it makes people shiftless and lazy from the right. So this was an answer to that. Well, why don't we give people who are not making a lot of money but still working the incentive to work by giving them a little bit of money? Still, nevertheless, this has been a target of Republicans, this supposed idea of rampant fraud. And so they've hammered the IRS to audit the working poor. So today, and this is the headline of one of our stories, and one of the shocking findings is that if you are a member of the working poor and you make $20,000 a year, your chances of being audited by the IRS are higher than if you are affluent. if you make $400,000 or $500,000 a year, you actually have a lower chance of being audited by the IRS than if you're a member of the working poor. And that's, I think, pretty shocking to most people. I don't know if it makes them angry at the IRS, but if it does, it shouldn't. It should make them angry at the pressures on the IRS to do that from political forces, mainly Republicans.
And you mentioned 2015 law. You write how EITC recipients are now more likely to have their refund held, something that can be calamitous for someone who is living month to month. So what was the intent of that law, and did Obama support it?
Yes, Obama supported it to his discredit. And this was a law that tightened up the regulations about EITC based on the idea that there was rampant fraud. And so now the IRS is required to scrutinize people who are receiving EITC even more so. And what this has led, Paul found, is to huge delays in this necessary money that has really made the working poor's lives even harder and more uncertain and more difficult. And you're dealing with the IRS and its bureaucracy. I mean, one thing I should make clear here is that the budget has been cut by the IRS severely, and that has led to a huge brain drain at the IRS. Tens of thousands of employees have left. And today we have fewer than 10,000 auditors at the IRS. That's lower than at any time since 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower was president and the economy was a seventh of the size it is today. So we have many, many fewer auditors. Now, in that situation, it's much easier to send an automated letter to do an automated audit of somebody poor. The rich and corporations, their audits are incredibly complex and time-consuming and require a lot of manpower and a lot of experience and intelligence. Now, the people who have left the IRS are the people who can leave the IRS by and large. That disproportionately, it's the higher quality people who can go find jobs in the private sector. Those are the people who are good at auditing the wealthy and corporations. And so that has really been the disproportionate place where the skills have dropped, and the beneficiaries of these budget cuts are the wealthy and corporations.
But you do point out that the earned income tax credit is often claimed in error. So why is it so often claimed in error?
Well, it's often claimed in error because this complicated set of rules that I was talking about earlier. You can have children who are living with you, and you can claim them as dependents on your taxes, but for the earned income tax credit, they don't qualify. And so one lawyer who, legal aid lawyer who talked to Paul said, look, I have third-year law students who I try to explain who qualifies and doesn't qualify for EITC, and they can't figure it out. It's just a set of rules and bureaucracy that's incredibly complicated. And unnecessarily so. If the government was sending out checks, were to send out checks to people making $22,000 instead of $20,000, or who had dependents, children who actually weren't living with them for the proper amount of time, that would not do harm to the government, or in fact, that would help the economy. To overly police this area of policy it's actually not effective. If we let a little bit of money seep out from the federal government and go to people who, quote unquote, didn't deserve it, but were still in the general area of working poor, that would help the economy and them a lot. And we shouldn't really sweat it, but we do.
You write that the estimate of improper payments when it comes to the earning income tax credit are about $17 billion is the reason the EITC is such a focus for the IRS. Some tax experts, including the Taxpayer Advocate Service and independent office within the IRS, argue the estimate is way too high. One reason is that it is based on the outcome of audits, and low-income taxpayers are much less likely to have competent representation, as you're pointing out, to dispute the IRS's conclusions. How much is the extent to which improper earned income tax credit payments are handed out? How much is that exaggerated. Is this yet another myth on the right on taxes?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and it's highly exaggerated. I don't think they have very good studies for this very reason, that the people don't dispute their audits because they don't have any representation, and so they just get into big spirals with the IRS. But also, as I was saying, is a huge amount of that fraud is tax preparer fraud, not the tax recipient of the IRS. I mean, of the EITC. So, and they don't really break that out well to really understand exactly how that breaks down. But a lot of these times, the EITC recipient is not the fraudster herself, but the victim of an unscrupulous tax preparer.
So why not just fix the law? Why not tighten up the wording of the earned income tax credit to make sure that people don't accidentally, and they're not even doing it accidentally. They're answering the questions that they get on their tax software. They're answering them correctly. Then all of a sudden they get the EITC and they find out that they really didn't qualify. So why isn't the earned income tax credit? Why isn't that being reined in? And why aren't these tax softwares being regulated?
Well, they did try to. That was the impetus of the 2015 changes, was to tighten up the regulation of this. And and what we suggest is that was really wrongheaded. That tightening up is actually does more harm than good, and is not the focus. But one of the things that the tax preparers have done, the lobbyists have done, is really fight against tax preparer regulation. And so the corporations like H&R Block have fought scrutiny over tax preparers, which has led to a relative lack of regulation of the preparers and that fraud. So if you wanted to tighten anything up, you don't necessarily tighten up the rules around EITC. You would tighten up actually the scrutiny around tax preparers so that you would actually see you could find and root out that fraud. But as I was saying earlier, the one regulator that would do that, besides the IRS, is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that's being gutted as we speak.
So you can't go to H&R Block to get your, or some place like that. You can't go there to have your taxes accurately done. In the meantime, we have IRS auditors who are poorly trained. It sounds like we're really not doing a very good job of not only filing our taxes, but knowing what happens within those taxes. And you also write that taxpayers of all kinds cheat. And IRS studies have found that the earned income tax credit recipients aren't close to the worst offenders. For certain kinds of business income, for instance, people pay only about 37% of the tax they owe because they simply don't report the income. Hundreds of billions of dollars in government revenue is lost. But people who have their own businesses are audited at about the same rate as earned income tax credit recipients. So why is it so hard to go after business income? Aside from the funding cuts and personnel shortages, is there anything baked into the system, into the rules on taxes, that makes it more difficult to reclaim improper business taxes than it is to go after the poor?
Yeah, well, so we were talking about this earlier. In you don't the income from a partnership or a sale of a business doesn't come out of your taxes right away. It doesn't come out of your income right away. You have to go and report that. And so there's enormous amount of leeway to hide and not report it. If you followed what Michael Cohen, the president's personal lawyer, was found guilty of, pled guilty to in federal court, it was part of it was tax fraud. And he just had a lot of businesses, and he would sell things or make money from things like taxi medallion businesses and then just not tell the IRS. And it's relatively difficult for the IRS to find that if they're not being told about it. So that's the kind of thing that where the billions of dollars that we're losing every year is coming from. It's not coming from the working poor. The rich are important to audit because that's where the money is and that's where the cheating is. I mean, it stands to reason. So this is where they really should do a much better job. And in fact, they're doing a much worse job.
Do we have any idea of how much people evade taxes every year? Would collecting that money have a significant impact on the U.S. budget, which is trillions of dollars?
So we actually don't have a great idea. So there's something called the tax gap, which is the best estimate that we have of how much we're losing in taxes every year through lack of enforcement and cheating and evasion and things like that. And it's roughly $600 billion, but which is obviously a huge number. But we don't really know what's going on right now because that study was last conducted in 2015 or 2016, and it actually covered the years of 2008 to 2010. And so that was before the budget cuts. So we have no idea what's going on now. What Paul and I realized is we're not going to know whether our tax system is broken until 2024, because that's when they're going to study these years, that when the IRS's budget has been broken. So we're not going to know if we have become Greece or Spain for, until it's a decade into it, until it's a decade too late.
How big of a risk is somebody taking if they decide not to file their taxes? Because you write, without enough staff, the IRS has slashed even basic functions. It has drastically pulled back from pursuing people who don't bother filing their tax returns. New investigations of non-filers, as they're called, dropped from 2.4 million in 2011 to 362,000 last year. According to the Inspector General for the IRS, the reduction results in at least $3 billion in lost revenue each year. So how big of a risk am I taking if I just decide I'm not going to even file my taxes?
Well, I mean, I would never advocate for not filing your taxes or for cheating on your taxes. I also think that we should take pride in paying our taxes, that this is an important aspect of being a responsible member of society. And so I am a believer in taxation, fair taxation, equitable taxation, not excessive taxation, but taxes pay for the basic functioning of our society in every single way you can imagine. But tax lawyers told us, multiple tax lawyers told us, it is a great time to be a tax cheat in America today.
That is really, really frightening. And you mentioned in response to Congressman telling the IRS chief Koskinen under Obama to keep the fact that you can't catch tax cheats to yourself. You wrote, Koskinen replied with a speech he'd given many times before and would give again. A collapse in tax compliance was really possible, he said. People will catch you. He worried about the U.S. becoming Italy or Greece. You then quote him telling Congress, what I don't want to do is have somebody later on say, you never warned us. This is your warning. Are we on the verge of a collapse in the U.S. economy because of tax cheats? How close are we to becoming Greece or Italy, devastated by tax cheats?
Yeah, I don't think we are there yet. I don't think Koskinen thinks that. I don't think any tax expert thinks that. But I think that we cannot continue to sustain the gutting of the IRS and not eventually have people catch up with it. And if you look to our article, you see the Republicans said, why are you so negative? Why are you complaining? You're just telling tax cheats that they can cheat. You're just by saying this stuff. Because Koskinen said this is a tax cut for tax cheats when you cut the IRS. And he said, we're having to do less with less. We can't just do more with less. And they said, you got to cheer up and don't be so negative. And the fact is that we are on the path. We are not there yet. I don't think any expert thinks we're there yet. We're flirting with disaster. And it's a very, very bad idea to dismantle the taxing authority of your government.
But the collected revenue is going up, even though IRS budgets are being slashed. So what explains why they're collecting more on less? Why doesn't that prove that this whole cost cutting actually works?
No. By a percentage of the GDP, we're collecting far less than we used to. So yeah, we're collecting more because the economy is growing, and we should be collecting more. But we're not collecting nearly as much as we should be because of the problems that the IRS have.
You mentioned Pam Reichs, the former senior manager in the IRS's offshore program, and that part of her task was to make sure that managers and revenue agents who feel pressure to show productivity did not cut these audits short. Some of the cases involved huge amounts of money, but IRS employees aren't supposed to think about that. Since the IRS Reform Bill in 1998, the agency is prohibited from evaluating agents based on how much money they bring in. Instead, they're evaluated on how effectively they open and close audits. Are IRS agents incentivized to shut investigations as quick as possible, and therefore more complicated cases are ignored or shut too quickly? Because you point out how the average time to complete an offshore audit, Reichs remembered, was close to 3 years. So is the current system, does it incentivize you to be productive through closing audits more than actually catching people?
Yes. Yeah, we didn't really even talk about that basic thing, which is that the number of audits has completely collapsed. The audit rate is down 42% since 2010. And it's particularly, the audit rate has fallen for the rich much faster than it's fallen for. And but that actually understates how bad it is, because quality has been much worse, because a lot of quality audits, and because of this problem of that they're spending on the audits. And as you just mentioned, the incentives are really bizarre. So they don't really look at how much they get from an audit or how much they can get from an audit, how much money they can get, how much tax cheating is available to them, because they're not allowed to go headhunting. After the 98 law that we talked about, that was created after a bunch of these hearings that were really filled with lies and myths. They took away this incentive, and you can see the logic to it. Well, we don't want people just IRS just demanding higher sums so that the auditors can look good. But on the other hand, it just creates a whole set of perverse incentives, and the main perverse incentive is that they have the incentive to open and close as many audits as they can, because that's what they're judged on. That's what productivity looks like, not whether the audits were good or not.
So what can I do to make certain that I am not some of the low-hanging fruit that auditors will go after in the IRS?
You mean what will not give you the red flags for an audit?
Yeah, outside of not filing.
Yeah, not filing is a big mistake. But of course, you just mentioned they go after many, many fewer non-filers than they used to. It's down by the hundreds of thousands. You're not supposed to. I don't even know the kind of personal finance tax cheating 101. You don't want to take a lot more expenses than you did in the last year, like big changes in your income or in your expenses 1 year to the next are the kind of typical red flags. The IRS tries to hide the kinds of criteria that it uses to pick out audits because of this very problem. They don't want to be gamed. And so it's a little unclear, but changes 1 year to the next are kind of the typical red flags.
Oh, sweet. So I just shouldn't get rich really quick. That's a great idea there, Jesse. So you write how the results of less tax fraud enforcement means, quote, huge losses for the government. Business owners don't pay $125 billion in taxes each year that they owe, according to IRS estimates. That's enough to finance the Departments of State, Energy, and Homeland Security, with NASA tossed in for good measure. Unlike wage earners who have their incomes separately reported to the IRS, business owners are often on the honor system. What do you mean by being on the honor system?
Yeah, well, we were talking about this earlier, is that if you make money from selling business, you don't necessarily have to report it to the IRS. And if you're a business owner and you're getting an enormous amount of income coming in, you're selling a lot of stuff, that also you need to report that to the IRS. The IRS doesn't have some magical ability to figure out what that is. And so that's essentially the honor system, which means that there's a lot of cheating there. That's where the cheating is, not where I have a W-2 and the IRS knows pretty much the vast majority of my income. 98% of my income, the IRS knows about.
So you write that the IRS has made little use of new weapons in the fight against wealth hidden overseas. In 2010, President Barack Obama signed a law that was supposed to provide crucial tools for government auditors and prosecutors. That law, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, required banks with American account holders to report information to the United States, like employers filing W-2 forms about their workers. These reports would force account holders to come clean. 8 years later, the program is still getting off the ground. Why is it taking so long? I mean, it started in 2010, and Obama had 6 years to get it going. Was it obstructed by Republican congressional and Senate majorities, or Republicans' refusal to fund? Why has it taken so long for these reforms to take place?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a really important part of this, which is that we haven't talked about criminal enforcement, but the IRS, in addition to auditing and collecting and looking at nonprofits, that all happens in the civil side of the business. There's a tiny criminal operation that goes after tax cheats, tax evasion, and one of these big tools, this kind of groundbreaking, game-changing tool that they got was FATCA, and FATCA was a law that required people who have overseas bank accounts to report to the IRS, and more helpfully, required banks, overseas banks, if they have Americans with bank accounts, they have to report that to the IRS. So this is something that could be incredibly helpful to finding tax cheats. The only problem is that there's zero enforcement of it, or almost no enforcement of it, and no use of it. The IRS is not using this information, and it's not using it for a variety of reasons. The computer systems were incompatible, and the budget cuts were hurting. Another thing was that the banks have just given them a ton of information, and they're swimming in terabytes of information, and they haven't figured out a way to look at it and sort it. So 8 years later, the law has made almost no impact on tax enforcement. It's a total bust. Now, that doesn't mean it'll always be a bust, but it's pretty shocking state of affairs.
You write that during the Obama administration, the IRS asked Congress for hundreds of millions of dollars to carry out their reforms, but received nothing. Since Trump took office, the Revenue Service has stopped asking. Will that change now in the democratically controlled House? Is there any guarantee in your mind that if Democrats, say, had control of the House and Senate following the 2020 election and a Democrat wins the presidency, in your opinion, do you think that would lead to the IRS finally being fully funded so it doesn't have to be looking at earned income tax credits and can go after the people and businesses who are doing the most tax dodging?
Fully funded, no. I mean, that'll take a generation, and it would take an enormous amount of political will. Probably will get a little bit more funding. There's already been a tiny bit more funding for customer service, they call it, sort of, fielding the phone calls from the Republican Congress in recently, not enforcement, which is really where the money needs to be. But the Republicans realized, oh my God, we passed this giant tax overhaul, and the IRS is not going to really be around to answer phones, to answer people's questions. They're going to get really pissed off about it and punish us politically. The Democrats have these incredibly ambitious tax plans, as you know. Warren has talked about a wealth tax, and people are talking about raising the highest tax rate, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, throughout 70%. So raising taxes on the wealthy is one of the hottest political policy ideas in Democratic politics right now. You can't take any of those policies seriously without an enforcement and implementation mechanism, and that's predicated on a functioning IRS. So to the extent that the Democrats actually want to do this, and they're not just trying to score political points and they're unserious, to the extent that they are actually want to be effective, they must fund the IRS and they must have some enforcement mechanism. And I've heard a little bit here and there from these politicians, but very little.
So you mentioned this funding of the phone calls, and apparently during the last tax season, people were calling up the IRS to get information about their taxes, and there weren't any there wasn't anybody there to actually answer the calls. There were some people, but there were essentially a skeleton crew. So you talk about how they've now gone back to funding these phone calls, especially with the rollout of the new tax plan, new tax cuts that the President Trump has put in place. It's important to have these kind of phone calls. How much, though, does that kind of funding, is that just about giving the public the impression the IRS is still working by answering taxpayer questions at tax time without actually making the IRS any better at collecting taxes or auditing taxpayers?
Oh, yeah. It has no effect on how they actually collect taxes. It's just, I mean, it does help. Like if you or I have a tax question and we want to go to the IRS, and we don't want to spend hours on hold. I mean, it's a brutal sort of thing to be on hold. So I wouldn't say it's useless, but it has no effect on whether they are collecting better or auditing better. Or enforcing tax cheating more. That's what they need to be doing, and that's what where the IRS's budget has been really hit.
How would you rate the job the IRS has done in rolling out the Republican tax overhaul?
It really remains to be seen. This spring is going to be the time that where we really tell. And the rules really, which have fallen to the IRS and the Treasury about how to govern corporate taxation, are really still being written, and they're the biggest beneficiaries of this, not just from the big tax cut to the corporate tax rate, but for all sorts of new ways and new games that they've played. So this is the tax reform. No tax expert in America on the right or the left thinks that the reform was a reform, thinks that the overhaul was effective or good. It was nothing remotely resembling a simplification of the tax code, but people think that it's rife with nonsensical provisions and arbitrary distinctions and contradictory aspects, and is not going to fulfill the goals that it laid out. So it's a huge mess. It doesn't fall necessarily only on the IRS. The Congress is responsible for that mess. It's not a good law, and it could be implemented poorly or not. We're going to have to see.
This would make me think, without this oversight, you're going to have a lot more corruption, a lot more crime taking place, whether it's seen or unseen or found or not found. So do you think it is, with these kind of slashes to the IRS budget, do you think it is increasingly likely that not only are corruption and crimes being committed, but that a scandal is inevitable, if not many scandals? Have we created a perfect environment for crime and corruption on Wall Street that will inevitably lead to scandal?
Yeah, we have. You take away the police, and crime runs rampant. And you know, the street that is filled with the most crime in America is the financial district of New York. It's Wall Street. So they're going to figure out ways to cheat, and with the regulators now voluntarily having put themselves to sleep, that's going to lead to a crime wave, and we're going to only find out about that in 5-10 years or so.
Well, at least it'll keep you busy, Jesse. That's a great thing.
Yeah, it's good for business. The Trump administration is very good for investigative reporters.
We've been speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Jesse Eisinger, who is a contributor to the sweeping ProPublica investigation, Gutting the IRS, which you can find at ProPublica.org. And you can follow Jesse on Twitter at EisingerJ. That's EISINGER, and then the letter J. As always, our final question for you, Jesse, is the question from hell, the question we hate to ask. You might hate to answer. Our audience is going to hate your response. Is defunding the IRS... I don't like that question. I'm going to go with another one. Can we afford the new Green Deal by refunding, by giving the funds to the IRS that it needs?
No. Green New Deal is not really a policy prescription that actually could be funded. It relies on a lot of kind of magical thinking about monetary policy and not really taxing authority. Taxation would not fund it. If we wanted to run giant deficits for a long period of time and hope that we could control them through disciplined budgeting, we could then do the Green New Deal, but I don't think that's politically realistic. So unfortunately, I think that the Green New Deal is a good answer for a major crisis in the world and in the environment that we need to start addressing, but it's not really a functional answer, and taxation is not remotely the way that we could fund it or solve it.
Well, that's the answer that everybody's going to hate. Thank you so much for being on the air, Jesse. I really appreciate you being back on this show. This really is fantastic writing, and I'm going to be bugging you in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.